As I begin, I'd just like to say that I'm conscious that the last Minister who stood up here to announce the government's spending plans was the late Brian Lenihan. I believe it's appropriate that his commitment to his country and the public interest should be acknowledged here today. Tomorrow, Minister Noonan will deliver his first budget as Minister for Finance. Today, I am, on behalf of the government, announcing the expenditure estimates which will complement tomorrow's announcements. I'd like to thank my parliamentary colleagues for facilitating this changed arrangement. The change is not simply about two departments and two ministers. Our budgetary process, as I will outline later, is about to change fundamentally. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues in government for the support during this process. This is a collective effort with all members of the government involved. There is no hiding from the fact that as a government we must take very difficult decisions. But these are decisions we must take in the long-term and strategic interest of the state and of its citizens. We are going through a painful process of adjustment. Public anger is acute because the public was not responsible for putting us in the position we are in. 12 months on from the arrival of the Troika, we have seen some improvement. Our position has stabilised. 12 months ago, we were Europe's problem. Now, problems in the European and global economy threaten our recovery. As a Labour Minister, I never expected, Ceann Comhairle, that I would be making the type of announcements I am making today. We have been forced to make difficult and unpalatable decisions. But we as a government are committed to being honest and upfront with the people in the hard choices that we must make. We have a significant fiscal deficit which needs to be closed. That's understood by all. We are bound by our commitments to our international partners. They are our lenders of last resort. For now, we depend on them to pay our way. Our country has suffered the greatest economic crisis in living memory, leading to a large fall in exchequer revenues. Tax revenues fell from €47.25 billion in 2007 to €31.75 billion in 2010, a fall of one-third in just 3 years. We are now rebuilding our revenue base, but we do not have the resources to fund all the services that we would wish or like to provide. The Minister for Finance has published the medium-term fiscal statement, which sets out the contribution to our consolidation effort from the different elements of the budget: taxation and current and capital spending. For 2012, we have to implement a fiscal consolidation of €3.8 billion to deliver a deficit of 8.6% of GDP. Of the total adjustment, €2.2 billion, or just less than 60%, will be on the expenditure side of the account, and the remainder of the adjustment being implemented through revenue measures. Capital spending will contribute, as I have already announced, €755 million to the consolidation of expenditure next year. Despite the difficult budgetary parameters, the capital investment programme for the years 2012 to 2016 will amount to approximately €17 billion, including €3.9 billion next year. Day-to-day expenditure from the Exchequer will contribute about €1.4 billion to this consolidation, which is the equivalent of 2.7% of total current spending. As an indication of the government's determination to alleviate the burden caused by measures announced today, this is €300 million less than provided in the last government's National Recovery Plan, despite the upward revision in our overall consolidation. Over the period 2009 to 2012, nominal current voted spending will be down from its peak by almost 7%. These reductions are at a time when we are facing increased demand for public services and when there are very strong spending pressures. In a recession, the government is a spender of last resort. Our spending is by necessity greater than our income this year. Government cannot simply abandon people who are dependent, sometimes critically, on public services. This is an important point. Despite reductions in overall numbers of public servants and public spending, we are delivering considerably more financial supports and services to our people. It's a point frequently forgotten in the public debate. The pressures on our social welfare budget are enormous. The financial allocation for job seekers payment alone is now 3 times the 2006 level. The demand for health services has also increased, and the number of medical card holders has increased a staggering 500,000 since 2007. In the education sector, demographic pressures mean that we need more teachers and classrooms to accommodate more children. This is unavoidable. The provision of state pensions has increased from €3.7 billion in 2007 to a projected outturn this year of €4.7 billion. We will need to continue to increase this financial allocation year on year due to our demographic profile. Next year, an additional allocation of €175 million will be required. While acknowledging these real pressures, government spending must nevertheless fall next year and in each subsequent year to 2015. Today's expenditure announcements are driven by a comprehensive review of expenditure carried out by government over the past 8 months. The review entailed root and branch analysis and assessment of all programmes of expenditure in an attempt to identify priorities for scarce resources in the years ahead. Everything was looked at, and options for savings drawn up by all government departments and ministers. I should also say that today does not mark the end of the expenditure reviews. Rather, it's a first step. We must constantly and consistently monitor and review public expenditure. We can't afford not to. We've decided that a fresh CRE-type exercise should be conducted on a regular basis to reset the multi-year expenditure ceilings in line with emerging government priorities and informed by new evaluations of which expenditure programmes are delivering real value for money. To this end, it is anticipated that the next CRE will be undertaken in 2013-2014 to inform the next phase of fiscal planning. The Government has a shared determination to ensure that the taxpayers receive value for money for the investment they make in our public services. Of course, the fact that there was a detailed and careful review of options doesn't make the difficult choices any easier, given the structure of spending. Spending on social supports make up 38% of current spending. Public service pay comprises 30%, and public service pensions 6%. All other programme expenditures make up the rest. From a sectoral perspective, the vast bulk of government expenditure on the current side is accounted for in healthcare, social protection and education. Together, these 3 departments make up 80% plus of total current spending. We can't make the savings that we need to make without touching sensitive policy areas. The expenditure decisions announced today reflect the need to make choices and to prioritise. With this in mind, the difficult decisions were based on 3 guiding principles: fairness, jobs and reform. We must ensure that the burden of recovery is shared fairly and that the most vulnerable in our society are protected as far as possible. We need to maintain social solidarity in the face of difficult times. My colleague, the Minister for Social Protection, recently referred to the challenge of social inclusion in an environment where unemployment has increased, incomes have fallen and the revenue available to government to fund public services has decreased. Despite this, the government remains committed to building a socially inclusive and fair society, and we are determined to do our utmost to protect the most vulnerable. Central to all of this is jobs. We need to keep people working and to get others back to work. Budget 2012 makes further inroads to dismantling barriers to employment, complementing progress on reorientating labour market activation and training policy. The Government recently committed to deliver a multi-annual action plan on jobs, with quarterly targets for delivery every year and a monitoring group to oversee implementation. The Action Plan for Jobs will address 7 principal areas: improving competitiveness and intensifying competition in sheltered sectors, supporting indigenous start-ups, assisting indigenous businesses to grow, attracting inward entrepreneurial start-ups, developing and deepening the impact of foreign direct investment, developing employment initiatives within the community, and exploiting sectoral opportunities identified as priorities that we can grow. The Government shortly will be publishing a policy statement on labour market activation called Pathways to Work. In it, we set out our strategy to reform labour market activation policy to prevent the drift into and to help the reduction of long-term unemployment. During 2012, we will prioritise places including in the further education and training sector, specifically for those on the live register for 12 months or more. We will also provide for a further rollout of the Springboard initiative to provide conversion courses to upskill and reskill unemployed people to meet skills shortages in new and emerging sectors. I am also providing for an allocation of €20 million for a new labour market activation fund. This fund will be specifically targeted at the long-term unemployed and will deliver upwards of 6,500 places next year. Reforming how government works to reduce costs and protect frontline services is also one of the government's guiding principles. We have, as a government, taken reform as our agenda. We already reduced the pay of the Taoiseach and ministers, reduced allowances and secretarial supports to former Taoiseach, reformed ministerial transport arrangements, changed paying conditions for senior public servants, reduced the number of Oireachtas committees, cut the overall cost of special advisers, taken measures to significantly reduce future public service pension cuts, produced a significant programme of agency rationalisation, cancelled many parts of the ill-conceived decentralisation programme, standardised annual leave arrangements for serving and new public servants, and launched the most ambitious programme for public service reform since the foundation of the state to improve customer services and to reduce costs.
I thought you would come out of the hat for me.
We are also pushing ahead for reforms in other areas of public service, including here in the Oireachtas, and we are insisting upon greater openness, transparency and accountability, underpinned by legislative changes where necessary. Today I am announcing that the public service pay bill will fall by €400 million next year. By the end of this year, the numbers employed in the public service will be below 300,000. Next year, the government plans to reduce the size by a further 6,000. By any standards, the reduction of 37,500 or 12% of staff set against 2008 levels by the year 2015 is a significant reform and poses enormous challenges. Reform of everything we do is required to deliver adequate services as we reduce that vast quantum of numbers. Proactive workforce planning is also essential to respond to those reduced numbers and to ensure that the right people with the right skill sets are in the right place. To this end, I am pleased to announce that there will be some limited recruitment into the public service next year. Critically, I want to move towards more targeted recruitment across a range of disciplines to enhance the skills and expertise available to policymakers in the coming years. Through reduced numbers, through the pay cuts that were applied in 2010 and through the ongoing pension-related deductions, the overall cost of paying public servants will have fallen €3.5 billion, or 20%, over the 7-year period between 2008 and 2015. In discussing public service pay, I think it is important to acknowledge that public servants have already made significant contributions. The impact of the pay reductions on the gross pay of public servants was progressive and ranged from almost 9% at clerical officer level to over 23% at Secretary General level. On a similar basis, a teacher would have incurred a reduction of 12%, a staff nurse 10.5%, a Garda 11%, while a middle-ranking public servant at higher executive officer level would have sustained a reduction of 12.3%. And of course those figures do not include the various tax changes that have been advanced across the board in recent years. That said, the Croke Park Agreement simply has to deliver. We've made a good start, but we've a long way to travel yet. I expect all public service bodies to address inefficiencies in their systems and to achieve substantial additional savings through the introduction of new working arrangements, including, where applicable, new rosters. Next year, public service bodies will have to achieve savings in respect of overtime of 10% and in allowances and premium payments of a further 5%. My department will lead a review of allowances and premium payments across the public service in consultation with all government departments next year. I can also now announce plans to overhaul public service sick leave arrangements, and discussions between my officials and the unions will commence shortly in that regard. We've been reducing public service pension levels. These are very significant measures, the nature and scale of which needs to be fully appreciated. In September, I published legislation to introduce a new single public service pension scheme for new entrants. It's estimated by the middle years of this century, annual spending on public service pensions will be about €5 billion per annum in 2010 terms, if no action was taken. The new single scheme will reduce that annual expenditure by about 35%, or a quantum of €1.8 billion. No further cuts for ordinary public service pensioners are proposed. Details of all spending decisions taken by the government are included in the book just published and handed around today on pages 21 to 88. The detailed estimates are also published. The relevant ministers will provide later today details of all such savings. In this announcement, I propose to set out some of the key saving measures. As I mentioned earlier, I believe that we have a duty to protect the most vulnerable in our society and to provide the safety net of social protection in what are very extraordinary times. We must also get people back to work, and have already set out some of our plans in that regard. Minister Noonan will discuss a range of other proposals tomorrow. The sharp reality that our government is facing is that the level of social welfare expenditure now in place cannot be sustained from the funding base now available. As unpalatable as it might be, we must make some difficult choices in order to contribute to the reduction of the budget deficit. Notwithstanding this, I can confirm today that the government has decided not to reduce any weekly rate of social welfare payment and to protect the universal child payment at a standard rate. We will endeavour to make savings from a range of measures. We will save €475 million in the social protection area next year. This is €190 million less than was set out in last year's National Recovery Plan. Over 2 years, we will standardise the rates of payments for child benefits for all children. This will save €43 million next year. We have decided to base the payment week for job seekers' benefit on a 5-day week rather than the existing 6-day week basis. This will save €5.9 million next year. From January 2013, employment on a Sunday will be taken into account when determining the level of entitlement to job seekers' payment. The government has decided to reduce the fuel season from 32 to 26 weeks. This will save €51 million. This is from 32 weeks to 6 months. This will save €51 million next year. Changes to the one-parent family payment will save €20.7 million. Changes to the redundancy and insolvency scheme to reduce the employer rebate from 60% to 15% will save €81 million. Increasing minimum contributions and reviewing rent limits will yield savings of €55 million in rent supplement, and changes to the present system of concurrent payments will save €21.8 million next year. Full details of the specific social welfare measures are set out in the expenditure report, along with a number of other changes to social welfare schemes and entitlements. My colleague, the Minister for Social Protection, will expand on these measures later. Expenditure on the health budget will be 26% of current expenditure, and that sector comprises around 1/3 of all public service employment. The scale of the resources being invested means the sector must continue to make a significant contribution to closing the deficit. At the same time, the government is very aware of the fact that the ageing population is already placing demands on essential health and personal social services. We will be using the reform programme to address these demands within the limited resources we have available. One of the main aims of the comprehensive review of expenditure for health was to reduce as far as possible the negative impacts on essential frontline services of the savings required to meet the budgetary targets and to facilitate real reform of health services so that we can improve the quality and quantity of services in the medium to long term. I am allocating €13,644 million for health next year. This will allow the healthcare system to meet the demands placed on it and in particular accommodate the growth in demand-led schemes such as medical card and long-term care. As part of this, I am allocating an additional €50 million to fund implementation of the programme for government commitments on mental health and access to GP care. €35 million of this is being made available for the development of community mental health teams and services as outlined in a Vision for Change. €15 million will fund access to primary care without fees to claimants of free drugs under the long-term illness scheme. This is the first step towards the government's objective of introducing major reforms in the health system. We must reduce our cost base and increase efficiencies to enable health service provision that delivers its essential services effectively, professionally and compassionately. We must strive to make savings so we do not impact on frontline services. Today I am announcing a total of €543 million in net savings in the health area, which in addition to reducing our deficit will be used to meet unavoidable additional pressures in health as well as the extension of key services in some areas. We will reduce numbers and contain costs to save €145 million, introduce measures to reduce the price of drugs such as reference pricing and generic drugs and reduce fees for services to save a further €112 million. We will increase the monthly threshold from €120 to €132 under the drug payment scheme to save €12 million. We will ensure efficiencies in procurement by active management and control of both price and volume of usage, which will save €50 million. Improve the generation and collection of private income into hospitals to save €143 million and secure 2% efficiencies in disability, mental health and children's services, saving €50 million. Details are set out in the expenditure report and again the Minister for Health will provide further details later. Education expenditure, including the National Training Fund, will comprise around 17% or €8,604 million next year and will continue to be a priority for the Government. At a time of resource constraints, we must invest in education and training and prioritise those programmes that deliver the best results and meet the requirements of children, parents, the disadvantaged and the labour force. We will continue to provide a full programme of training and further education through Solace and the VECs and other educational bodies. These programmes will be actively focused on helping the unemployed return to the labour force. We will continue to make substantial provision for children with special needs in terms of resource teachers and special needs assistants. We have had to make the difficult decision to increase student contributions in order to protect the higher education sector from what would otherwise have been greater cuts. While we have had to make savings by abolishing student support for some new postgraduate students, we will make a contribution towards the fees of postgraduate students from the lowest income backgrounds. Substantial allocations will also continue to be made to assist students from lower income backgrounds to achieve undergraduate qualification. The Department of Education and Skills will continue to drive to reduce administrative costs by proactively pushing rationalisation, efficiencies and economies in budgets, including the rationalisation already announced of VECs, the optimal configuration of school provision, reviewing allowances, the establishment of a single awarding authority for student grants and the merger of various educational bodies. The measures in the education areas which I am announcing today will save €132.3 million next year. This will allow the necessary expenditure targets to be met, but will also provide the Minister for Education and Skills with the necessary resources to pursue important policy initiatives such as junior cert reform and the implementation of the literacy and numeracy strategy. The 2012 saving measures include a requirement for post-primary schools to manage guidance provision from within their existing pupil-teacher ratio allocation to save €10.4 million, a reduction in capital grants to schools by 2%, which will save €7 million, phased withdrawal from 2012 of supports in some schools from earlier disadvantaged schemes predating the current DESH schemes, which will save €6.5 million, reduction of costs associated with trainee and apprenticeship schemes, which will read 19.2 million, a 2% reduction in core funding for higher education, which will secure savings of 23.6 million, an increase by €250 in the third level student contribution will secure €18.5 million next year. Changes to fee and maintenance supports for new postgraduate students and reducing maintenance grants generally will deliver savings of €12.6 million. These three areas, social protection, health and education, contain measures that will yield savings of over €1 billion next year. Most other departments will also experience reductions, and the details are set out in the expenditure report. Selected measures include the Department of Agriculture, Marine and Food, measures amounting to savings of €105 million, Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport, savings amounting to €45 million, and the Department of Environment, measures amounting to €34 million. Of course, other departments, as you will see in the estimates booklet you have, are making a contribution to lower spending. These measures are significant. Taking account of offsetting spending measures, the Government's decision to reduce public spending to €55.8 billion next year compared to €57.7 billion in 2011. As part of the new approach to budgeting, I am setting out the overall expenditure envelope for each year to 2014, with spending ceilings of just under €54 billion in 2013 and just under €52 billion in 2014. Full details of each department allocation are set out in Part 2 of the expenditure report. Correcting our public finances inevitably involves very difficult decisions by government. But this year's comprehensive review of expenditure has not just been about identifying cutbacks. There is a much more fundamental problem that we are now tackling. The fact is that Ireland's traditional system of budgeting no longer works for us. The old budgeting system that we have inherited from the past is secretive and opaque. It has not led to sustainable spending policies, to proper value for money, or to good outcomes for our citizens. Under this government's programme, we are committed to bringing about a major transformation of Ireland's old-fashioned budget system. The key elements of the reform agenda we have outlined in the Public Service Reform Plan, which I announced on the 17th of November. Today, in the comprehensive expenditure report that I am presenting to the Dáil and to the public, I am pleased to announce that these expenditure reform measures are being implemented across all fronts. In brief, the main features of the new budgetary architecture are as follows. First, this government will plan for sustainable public expenditure. The government's spending plans, along with our tax plans, are anchored in a clear vision of how the public finances will be managed over the coming years. A sustainable expenditure plan will build confidence at home and abroad about our commitment to deliver our public services in a reasonable and achievable way. Second, we will introduce a modern, multi-annual expenditure framework. The annual estimates campaign that we have heard about for years, conducted privately within a system of public administration, will next year be replaced by a medium-term framework with transparency about the allocations available to each department over a 3-year period. This will open the way to proper structural planning based on priorities and upon reform, with full public input and full proper Dáil oversight. Thirdly, we will introduce evidence-based expenditure policy. In a time when resources are exceedingly scarce, old expenditure lines are no longer sacrosanct, and all areas of spending must be subject to rigorous scrutiny. As part of this year's comprehensive review, all areas of spending have been examined. The momentum from this process must be maintained. A tough, clear, new value for money code is being launched today to redouble the process of ongoing scrutiny and evaluation across the entire public service. Fourthly, we will build performance information into the annual estimates. This year, for the first time, most departmental estimates will be presented in a new format, so that performance information can be scrutinised by Dáil committees at the same time that public money is being requested. In other words, it is not about just the money, it is about what you do with the money, and we will be able to evaluate that. And fifthly, we will enhance the role of the Oireachtas. That is for those in the Oireachtas who want to engage constructively in this process. All of those reforms support Oireachtas members as representatives of the people in holding government to account. The government is also moving to a new whole-of-year budgetary timetable to allow for Dáil committees to engage earlier and more fully on the estimates allocations before they are settled in each year. This government is in effect a national government containing the two largest parties in the state. It provides the stability necessary to plan and to work our way out of this crisis. It won't be easy, Finian, and we will not resolve our problems overnight. No government, whatever its numbers, wants to be the bearers of bad news, but our options are extremely limited. Ceann Comhairle, the public know that, and it's wary of those who offer simplistic options. We're at the start of a reform process. Today and tomorrow are significant days in that process, but our work is ongoing. Our resources are now more scarce, but we do have choices, and this government is choosing to divert these scarce resources, albeit not at levels we previously enjoyed, into those areas of the economy and societies where they are most needed. Today, despite the tough decisions we've had to take, we've been able to maintain core social welfare payments, including job seekers' allowance and state pensions. We've maintained family income supplement, carers' entitlements and disability allowances, our support for special needs assistance in our schools and the pupil-teacher ratio in the primary sector. Tomorrow, my colleague, the Minister for Finance, will announce his first budget. This should be viewed in conjunction with the measures I have announced today. As a country, we've already endured 4 years of hardship, yet we remain an innovative and creative people. Faced with a more benign European economy and with clear and determined leadership, this nation will prosper again.
Thank you, Minister.